Now let's review what we've learned from the lectures on learning, which included phobias, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. Let's start with phobias. A phobia is a very intense fear. To count as a clinical disorder, it must be so severe that it interferes with daily life. Classical conditioning is often used to explain phobias. A simple classical conditioning experiment typically begins with a baseline phase, which is used to show that a neutral stimulus like a bell doesn't automatically elicit a response, whereas an unconditioned stimulus like meat powder automatically elicits an unconditioned response like salivation. Then, in a conditioning phase, the neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus for several trials. Finally, in a test phase, we see that the formerly neutral stimulus now elicits a response. So, the bell is now a conditioned stimulus and it elicits a conditioned response of salivation. Over 100 years ago, the psychologist John Watson used a similar procedure to create a phobia-like condition in little Albert. This way of thinking about phobias helps to explain some important phenomena, such as why phobias sometimes extinguish over time but may also spontaneously recover, and why phobias sometimes generalize to other things that were not originally conditioned. This has led to therapies that can be very effective at helping people overcome phobias. However, classical conditioning alone doesn't fully explain phobias. First, unlike most types of classical conditioning, phobias can be triggered by a single event. Second, phobias often start as milder fears that arise without any conditioning. Third, phobias are much more likely to occur with some types of stimuli than with others. Fortunately, more recent research has shown that other aspects of learning can fill in the gaps where classical conditioning is insufficient to explain phobias. First, research on taste aversion learning has shown that biologically significant associations can be learned with a single pairing. Second, research on observational learning explains how some fears can begin without any conditioning, just by seeing fear responses in others. Finally, research has shown that we are biologically prepared to learn some kinds of associations, like snake fear associations, more readily than other kinds of associations, such as flower fear associations. So, even if we may never understand every detail of how I came to have a mild snake phobia, research on learning does a pretty good job of explaining how phobias typically arise, how they persist and sometimes phase, and how they can be treated by means of psychotherapy. Whereas classical conditioning helps us explain phobias, operant conditioning helps us explain things like why people play slot machines. The key difference between operant and classical conditioning is whether the subject has any control over what happens in the experiment. In classical conditioning, the conditioned stimulus is followed by the unconditioned stimulus, whether or not the subject makes the conditioned response. In contrast, the reinforcer in an operant conditioning procedure occurs only if the subject makes the operant response. A key part of operant conditioning is the concept of a schedule of reinforcement. This is just a set of rules that describe the relationship between the subject's responses and the reinforcer. In a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement, the subject is reinforced after every nth response. For example, in a fixed ratio 20 schedule, the subject is reinforced after every 20th response. A variable ratio schedule is similar, but the number of responses per reinforcer varies around some average. In a variable ratio 20 schedule, for example, the subject is reinforced on average every 20 responses, but the actual number of responses per reinforcer varies. For example, sometimes the reinforcer happens after the 5th response and sometimes after the 35th response. Variable ratio schedules typically lead to the highest rates of responding. Many types of gambling involve variable ratio schedules of reinforcement, and this helps to explain why people will gamble even though they're more likely to lose money than to win. Variable ratio schedules also lead to the slowest extinction, so you need to be careful about accidentally setting up a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement for behaviors that you don't want to encourage.